It's about what?
I'm sad for those who don't feel that they are loved in order to work in this life.
There are people who leave this world quietly, and then there are people whose absence reshapes it. Fred Rogers was the second kind. For more than 3 decades, he walked into American living rooms, wearing a soft cardigan and a smile that never felt rehearsed. He spoke to children as though each one of them was the only person in the world worth talking to. And when he died on February 27, 2003, millions of people who had never met him personally grieved, as though they had lost someone from their own family. But here's what most of those people never knew. The man behind Mr. Rogers carried things that the camera never caught: sorrows, doubts, and battles that his wife, Joan Rogers, protected with fierce and loving silence for years, until finally she didn't. Before her own death in January 2021, Joan Rogers began to speak, not to sensationalize, not to rewrite history, but to complete it. What she shared was not a scandal. It was something far more valuable: the full humanity of a man the world had turned into a symbol. And if you loved Fred Rogers, truly loved him, then what Joan revealed will only deepen that love. Fred McFeely Rogers was born on March 20th, 1928, in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, a small steel town east of Pittsburgh. He was a shy, heavy-set child who spent a great deal of time alone, finding companionship in puppets, music, and his own imagination. His grandfather, Fred Brooks McFeely, was among the most important figures in his early life, a man who made him feel genuinely seen and told him directly, "You've made this day a special day, by just your being you." Fred would carry those words for the rest of his life. He would eventually give them back to the world. He graduated from Rollins College in Florida with a degree in music composition and went on to study at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, where he was ordained as a Presbyterian minister in 1963. But his calling, the one that truly defined him, came from an unexpected place: a television set. When Rogers first saw television in 1951, he did not see entertainment. He saw people throwing pies at each other's faces. He saw chaos dressed up as fun, and something in him said, this medium could do so much more. That instinct changed American childhood. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood premiered on PBS in 1968, at a time when children's television was loud, fast, and colorful in the most frenetic sense of that word. Fred Rogers built something that moved at the speed of trust. He hung up his jacket, put on his cardigan, changed his shoes, and sang the same song every single time. Not because he lacked creativity, but because he understood that children find safety in repetition. He understood that before a child can grow, they need to feel safe. The show ran for 33 seasons and produced 895 episodes. It addressed divorce, death, racism, disability, and grief, topics most adults still flinch at discussing with children. Fred Rogers did not flinch. He leaned in. He spoke to his young audience with a directness and respect that their own parents sometimes struggled to offer. And he did it all through a combination of quiet conversation, visits to the neighborhood of make-believe, and the occasional guest who brought music or art or simple human warmth. The puppets he voiced himself were not accidental. Daniel Tiger, the shy and sensitive one; King Friday the 13th, who needed to be in control; Lady Elaine Fairchild, who acted out and pushed boundaries. Those characters were not just for the children watching. They were parts of Fred himself, explored and expressed at a safe distance. He understood his own interior life because he had done serious work to understand it. That work, often unseen, was the foundation of everything. Joan Bird was born in 1928 in Jacksonville, Florida, and by the time she arrived at Rollins College as a music performance major, she had already developed the kind of inner stillness that comes from knowing exactly who you are. She was a concert pianist of real ability. She was sharp, funny, and not easily impressed. When she first encountered Fred Rogers, she noticed what most people noticed: his gentleness. What she looked deeper for, and found, was his substance. They fell in love in the quiet way that lasting love often begins. Practice rooms and shared recitals. Long conversations that outlasted the music. After graduation, Fred moved to New York to work with NBC, and the two maintained their relationship through letters, a discipline that suited both of them. Fred proposed by mail. Joanne said yes by running to the nearest telephone booth. They married in 1952 and remained married for more than 50 years. They had 2 sons, James and John. Joanne was never a woman who defined herself by her husband's fame. She continued to perform as a concert pianist, recording 2 albums with her longtime piano partner Janine Morrison. She taught music at 2 Pittsburgh area colleges. She had her own life, her own art, her own voice. What she gave Fred was not subservience. It was something harder to find, genuine partnership. She understood his silences. She absorbed his anxieties. She challenged him when he needed it and held him when he couldn't hold himself. Here is where Joanne's testimony matters most, because the world built Fred Rogers into something close to a saint, and Joanne, who loved him more than anyone, would not allow that. Not because she wanted to diminish him, because she understood that a saint is untouchable, and Fred was not untouchable. He was human, and his humanity was exactly what made him worth remembering. Joanne was direct about this in interviews in the years following Fred's death. He was, she said, genuinely as kind as people believed. That part was not performance. But kindness did not come without cost. Fred worked at it every day. He made deliberate choices to lead with patience, to respond with care, to resist the ordinary frustrations that pull the rest of us toward sharpness. It was a discipline, not a default. And discipline, even the kind rooted in love, is exhausting. There were days when Fred came home carrying the weight of everything he had poured into the work. Days when the responsibility of being a symbol to millions of children pressed down on him in ways that were not visible to those millions. He kept strict personal rituals to manage that weight. He swam every morning. He maintained his body weight at exactly 143 pounds because 1 stands for I, for love, and 3 for you. Even his relationship with the scale was a daily act of intentional meaning-making. That is not the behavior of a man who found goodness easy. That is the behavior of a man who found goodness necessary and pursued it accordingly. Joanne also acknowledged the imbalances that long marriages always contain. In their household, she was more often the disciplinarian when it came to their sons. Fred struggled with that role. He was the gentle one, sometimes to a fault, and that left Joanne carrying weight that should have been shared. She did not say this with bitterness. She said it plainly, the way someone speaks when they have had decades to understand a complicated thing fully. In the fall of 2002, Fred Rogers began experiencing discomfort that he initially attributed to age and stress. Indigestion, a general unease in his body that he managed quietly, adjusting his diet, waiting for it to pass. Fred was not a man who rushed toward doctors or complaint. He was the kind of person who processed his difficulties privately before sharing them with the world, if he shared them at all. But the discomfort did not pass. It grew. When he finally sought medical evaluation, the diagnosis arrived without mercy. Stomach cancer, already advanced. The cancer had not been caught early. There would be no clean surgical solution, no optimistic prognosis. Joanne learned this alongside him, and what followed were the final months of their life together. Months that she has described with honesty that is almost painful in its clarity and almost beautiful in its love. Fred underwent surgery and a course of treatment that took a visible toll. But he did not disappear from the world. In January 2003, less than 6 weeks before his death, he appeared as the Grand Marshal of the Tournament of Roses parade in Pasadena. He showed up, even diminished, even knowing what he knew. He showed up for his commitments. Joanne watched him do this and understood it was not stubbornness. It was Fred being Fred, until the last possible moment. What Joanne has described about those final weeks is where the awful truth of the title lives, and where it transforms into something else entirely. The truth is not that Fred Rogers was secretly unkind or hypocritical or broken in ways that betray his image. The truth is that he was frightened, that he had moments of profound doubt, that the man who had spent his entire life telling children their feelings were valid had his own feelings, and they were not always peaceful ones. He confronted death the way all of us would if we were honest about it, with uncertainty, with grief for what he was leaving behind, and with the people he loved gathered close. In one of the most quietly devastating things Joanne has ever shared publicly, she recalled sitting beside Fred near the end and telling him that everything was going to be all right, that their sons would be okay, that she would find a way to be okay. She told him this not because she was certain of it, but because she wanted him to leave at peace, and she believed he did. "I could feel he went at peace," she said, "and even with joy." Fred Rogers died at home on February 27, 2003. He was 74 years old. His death was announced, mourned, and memorialized in the way that public figures' deaths are. But for Joanne, the loss was not a public event. It was the end of more than 50 years of daily life with a person who had known her completely. 2 years after his death, Joanne spoke with a frankness that cut through every polished obituary. She said that grief does not operate on a timeline, that some days she felt energy returning, and other days she felt entirely emptied. She said she wished she could simply tell herself that the time for grieving was finished, that it was time to move forward, but it did not work that way. "Grieving can be exhausting," she said, with the plain honesty of someone who had stopped pretending otherwise. This, too, is part of the truth Joanne brought into the light, not just Fred's truth, but her own. She had been his partner, his anchor, his witness, and when he was gone, she had to find out who she was without that structure around her. The answer, it turned out, was that she was still very much herself, a pianist, a mother, a woman of wit and depth and endurance. Joanne Rogers did not retreat after Fred died. She became the chair emerita of Fred Rogers Productions and remained a visible, vocal presence in efforts to preserve and extend his work. She appeared in documentary films about Fred, including the widely acclaimed Won't You Be My Neighbor, released in 2018. She gave interviews that humanized Fred without diminishing him. She made a cameo appearance in the 2019 film A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, starring Tom Hanks as Fred, lending the project a legitimacy and personal warmth that no casting choice alone could have provided. She advocated for Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, the animated successor to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, which has introduced Fred's emotional vocabulary and values to an entirely new generation of children. She spoke publicly about kindness, about children's emotional lives, about the importance of adults who are willing to sit with a child's pain instead of rushing past it. She was, in every meaningful sense, continuing the work. Joanne Rogers died on January 14, 2021, at the age of 92, in the Pittsburgh home she had shared with Fred. She was surrounded by family. She is survived by her sons and by a legacy that belongs to her as fully as it belongs to the husband whose name the world knows better than her own. The phrase, awful truth, implies revelation of something that destroys. But what Joanne Rogers revealed about Fred does something harder and rarer. It makes him real. A man who chose kindness every day even when it exhausted him is not less admirable than a man for whom kindness required no effort. He is more admirable. A man who faced death with fear and still managed to leave in peace is not diminished by that fear. He is deepened by it. Fred Rogers spent his professional life telling children that their feelings were acceptable, that they did not need to hide what was difficult or uncomfortable, that the full range of human emotion was not something to be ashamed of, but something to be understood. The profound irony is that the world wanted to exempt Fred himself from that teaching. They wanted him to be above the feelings he helped others name. Joanne refused to let that stand. By telling the truth about who Fred was, she honored who Fred was. The man who got tired, the man who doubted, the man who weighed himself to 143 pounds every single day as a private promise to love the world, the man who could not always be the disciplinarian his sons needed, the man who was frightened at the end and still found peace. That man is worth more than any icon, because that man is actually possible. That man is something we can actually try to be. Fred Rogers once said that the greatest gift you can give is your honest self. Joanne Rogers gave that gift on his behalf, long after he was gone. She told the truth about a man she loved, and in doing so, she made his goodness available to all of us in a new way, not as something to worship from a distance, as something to reach for from wherever we are. That is the legacy. That is the neighborhood, and the door is still open.